Hello, and welcome back to my YouTube channel, Makery on the Hill. I'm Carol, a quilter who loves to teach and share with others tips and techniques dear to my heart. Before I begin with my tutorial today, let me explain a little bit about what I'm doing and why I'm doing it. As part of my teaching on the local level, I have been spearheading teaching a quilt that's titled Alice's Wonderland Sampler Quilt. If you're not familiar with it, it is written by Alice Caroline, and it has 100 blocks with all different sorts of techniques. It has everything from flying geese, quarter square triangles, simple strips, half square triangles. It also involves flying geese, and the block that we're going to do today is found in a section that is using templates. It has a little bit of EPP, English paper piecing, in the book, and also some applique. As I show today's block that we're going to be doing, let me explain a little bit about why I am teaching it the way I am. This particular block that we're going to be doing today is going to be in the book, if you happen to have the book, is block number 52, which is a Peaky and Spike type of a block. The book uses templates to make the block. I have found that I do not care to use templates if I do not have to. I can, and I have, but it's not my favorite way to piece. And I know many people that use templates also do hand piecing, not always, but many times. And I'm not a big hand piecer. I love to hand applique and other things, but not necessarily hand piece. So in saying all of this, what I'm saying is that I am not a purist in terms of how I accomplish a quilt. I don't necessarily follow the pattern writer's directions because I find that there are oftentimes other methods that I enjoy better and I find more success with. And as I have taught that, many of my students also follow that kind of general guideline. And so they are always welcomed to do it their own way with their technique, if they have a favorite technique, but also try perhaps a different technique that I'm teaching, or do it as the pattern in the book shares. Today, as we look at this block, it is known as a Peaky and Spike block, where it has a main triangle in the middle, and then it has two angular triangles coming off to the sides of it. Sometimes you might hear it called Spiky and Peter, so it goes by different names. As I said, the book uses templates to cut the pieces for this block, and I have shared with my students a foundation paper piece pattern to do the block, and I'm doing the YouTube video pretty much for them, but if you can benefit from it, by all means, I hope you will watch. Subscribe to my channel if you are so inclined, so that you can see what other little tips I might share along the way. And if you don't follow me, I'm very active over on Instagram, where I'm cshriver870, and I hope you will follow me if you don't already over there. So as I talk about the pattern today, I said that I foundation paper pieced many things if I can. I think foundation paper piecing is a super way of getting your seams accurate, because you are sewing directly on the line. If you have a variation in your seam allowance, it's not going with your regular stitching. It's not going to matter here, because you're following lines that's already marked there that you stitch along. So it's going to come out perfectly aligned with whatever dimension it's supposed to in the end. This is the paper piecing pattern that I have printed off for my students. Today's block needs 4 of the units, and so I'd like to just mention a little bit before I get into actual how we actually sew this unit and and layer it. This is what the unit looks like on all of my students' paper, these three here. This I have drawn for demonstration purposes only. When I go to sew, now I'm getting ahead of myself, but I just think it's easiest for you to see here. And you may want to zoom in with your on your channel. When I am sewing, I do not just start right there at that point on that line and end right there on that point. I like to come clear on off out of my, the outer line is going to be where I'm going to do my trim up at the end. So I like to come clear off. That way I have stitches in my seam allowance. If I start right there and end right there, that means my seam allowance has no stitches in it. And I do like to have stitches in that seam allowance. And so when I put this under the machine to sew this line, I'm going to just eyeball and start out here so that I have a straight line continuing right on the line that's marked, and using my eyeballs again, just continue straight off and to basically just the plain paper. Now, I want to point out that when you do that, and I drew a line here just simply so that you could see what that looks like. When I drew the line, let me get something to point with so that you can see it a little bit, what I'm referring to a little bit better. You will see that it intersects right up here when I draw these two lines and extend them. But down here, when I'm coming right through the point of my actual block, you will see that the straight line is not in the corner of the block. So in order to get it over here, it would not be a straight line. This is correct. And so I just like to point that out to you, and we're going to come back and reference that at the end. So just remember that you're doing a straight line, and your straight line, don't think you're making a mistake when you're sewing that seam, because it's not ending up in the corner. You actually don't want it to end up in the corner, okay? Just trust me in that step and in that process. So moving on then, the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to take this piece of paper and I'm going to cut and separate, just a rough cut, my 4 blocks that I need to make. So you can see that I just have rough cut them, just cutting off some of the excess paper so it's a little easier to maneuver underneath my machine. I do not like to cut right on that outer line. I like to leave excess because I think that you can always get a truest cut the first time you cut, you know, on a line. And so we're going to trim it all up in the end where we'll get everything else cut away. So just rough cut for now, okay? So I have 4 pieces rough cut. I'm going to lay this aside. And I have also cut, I like to pre-cut my fabrics if I can for paper piecing. I think it's much easier to work with. You know, you go for a YouTube video on paper piecing and you can find, I believe every quilter does it a little differently. So that's just simply proof that there's no one right way, there's no wrong way. It's what works for you. And what I'm sharing today is what works best for me. And if there's something you can pick up along the way, that makes me happy. So I have actually 4 of these pieces cut. This is going to be my center triangle, my whole triangle in the middle. And then my pieces, that's going to be my angled pieces. I need 8 of them. So again, looking at the block that we're going to be making, my center triangle, I'm doing one reversed from what you guys will be doing, okay? So it's actually not this, I was making another block, and I hope this doesn't confuse you. So I'm going to have a block that's going to be the center there, and then my triangles on the side are going to be my background fabric. So it's going to be just opposite from what this block actually is. This is the block that my students are making this week, this month. I'm working ahead because I already have that block done. And so the next block I need to do uses the opposite with the main fabric and the background fabric. So I have 4 of these cut because they will be what is the background here. I have 8 of these cut because they're going to be the side peak of the block. So the first thing I need to do is I'm going to take, and I like to use, you do not need one to do this with, but I like to use my light box just because I find it so much easier to do it with the light box in my sewing area than holding it up to the light, because I have a flat surface to put things on as I do it. And I unplugged my light box. Whoops. So let me get it plugged back in because the light was glaring, and you guys don't need to see the glaring light. And let me get it over here so that you can now see it. And I'm not going to use it, but the very first step. So I know my overhead light kind of shines there, so bear with me just for a minute. You're going to take that main triangle piece, which, like I say, is a print one for me, and I'm going to lay it face down on my light box. And I'm laying it face down because the next piece I'm going to put to it, we always have to have right sides together. So just again, trust me in the process. You're going to lay it face down. You're going to take and put a dot of glue, and I simply use Elmer's glue stick. Put a little dot of glue in the center of the main part where you're going to be placing your piece. And there, let me get it turned up. You're going to then be able to see through there and just make sure that you have fabric all the way around. And I'm not sure, hopefully you can see that. If I hold it up this way, sometimes when you hold it up backwards, actually to the light, if you're not using a light box, you can see through it easier. But it's covered completely into the seam allowances. So that's the only place, and I'm just going to kind of press there so that it sticks and holds temporarily. It doesn't need to hold a long time. And I don't need my light box anymore at this point. So I'm going to just turn that back off or get it back here out of the way so that that light doesn't glare for you. Okay, at this point, I'm going to turn it over, and this is where I'm going to pick up one of my side angle pieces. So I'm getting ahead of myself, sorry. Okay, I'm going to not turn it over. Okay, I took it off my board. Print side down was on my board, or if you're just doing it with a window light or an overhead light, print side out. Next to your paper is the back side of your fabric, the wrong side of your paper. So 2 wrong sides together here. You have to keep this without any fabric over top, because if I put a piece of fabric over top of that, let me demonstrate, how are you going to see where you're sewing on the lines? I said you're sewing on lines. You won't be able to see the lines. You just cover them up. So you know you've done something incorrectly. So at this point, I am going to fold. I have a lot more fabric here than I need. I need to get this angled, and I need to have from this piece here a 1/4 inch seam allowance and a 1/4 inch seam allowance coming over into the gray area. Oops, let me get back up here a little bit. Again, 1/4 inch seam allowance needs to be here and here from this piece, and you can see I have a lot more of an overhang than a 1/4 inch. So I like to use a piece of heavy duty cardboard. Some people use template plastic. I like the cardboard because I feel like I do a better job of folding my fabric against it and not cutting into it. With template plastic, I sometimes would get a little happy and cut where I shouldn't be cutting. Also, I'm going to be using a ruler that is called an add a quarter. And I have an add a quarter that is simply, it's yellow, it's simply add a 1/4 inch. This company also has a ruler. and I believe it's pink in color, and it is kind of an all-in-one ruler. It's an add a quarter on one side. There's a quarter, there's a lip here on this. It's kind of like a block, if you're familiar with block lock rulers, it's kind of like a block lock ruler. Has a lip on it. This side is tapered down so that you can fold your fabric over it like I'm using the cardboard. So if you have a pink one that has the two specialty edges, you don't need the cardboard or the plastic template. You can simply use the ruler all of the way. But like I say, I bought mine back before they invented the other one, and I don't mind using the cardboard. It's just fine for me. So I'm going to take the cardboard and I'm going to line it up on that line that I'm going to be sewing on. I fold my paper back over. I slip that ruler and it's going to lock right in there against that edge of the cardboard, and I'm going to use my rotary cutter and I'm going to trim off, and now I have a 1/4 of an inch, and you can't tell because you can't see through that, I know, but I have a 1/4 of an inch seam hanging over into the gray area. Now, because this piece is such a simple piece to do, I can go right ahead and I can do both of those folds before I ever begin to sew anything. Many times you have to do it one at a time, but for this block, it's a very simple foundation paper piece block, and I can go ahead and trim both sides. And so now I have that perfectly shaped triangle with my 1/4 inch seam on both sides of the line. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to lay it right side up. I'm going to take one of my background pieces and I am going to kind of peek through. Again, you can use your, I have enough light here, I don't need to, but you can use your light box, another great place to use your light box. And I'm going to align, making sure that my piece is big enough to come out past where I can see through here where I'm going to be doing my trim. And I simply align my second piece to my first piece, and I either hold it, if I'm right by my machine, I can simply keep a hold of it, flip it over, and put it underneath my machine and do my stitching. Now, I'm not at my machine, so I'm going to grab a couple of straight pins. Have to reach around here. I couldn't have everything right in front of me. There wasn't enough room. So I'm going to grab a couple of my straight pins and I'm going to pin. I like to pin when I do this. Notice which direction I'm putting my pins in. And notice how far down I'm putting my pins. Because I'm going to be flipping this back over to sew on the line, I'm going to leave my pins in to sew because my pins are going to be out of the way of my 1/4 inch, or if anything, it's just right there on the very tip and it's not going to hurt anything. Now, when I sew, when I go to my machine to sew it, remember my eyes are going to be starting out here, and I am making stitches coming all the way right on the line, and I extend out and stop somewhere out in outer space, out in my extra paper. So what that looks like then, when I get that stitched, it looks like this one. I have my original triangle. I put my second piece on top. This is, for those that, if you can't tell on video, it's really hard to show some things on video, but this is my outer trim line here. I can see through there, and so you can see that this is going to be in my outer trim, and this is going to get trimmed. I flipped it over. I put my pins in, flipped it over, and I should have used a contrasting thread so you could see easier, but I did not. And so here's my stitches. These are my stitches I can collar on there because that's going to get trimmed off. You can see it's not lined up with that corner, but it is in straight alignment with my straight line. And then again, I end up out in my excess paper. When you foundation paper piece, turn your machine stitch length smaller. I like to stitch with about a 1.8. I know it's difficult if you do something wrong and you need to unsew. If I do need to unsew with the 1.8, it's really fine to get my seam ripper up underneath one of those stitches. So I like to pick it out this way, like getting my seam, picking out that stitch, and then I can kind of pull that back and kind of flip my stitches that way. It's much easier for me to see. And you can't, and that's also probably saves your paper the best if you need to rip out, because if you rip out, it really does tear your paper. If you find that happens, just take a piece of Scotch tape and tape your paper back together, stitch over it, and it'll be fine. It'll all come back out when you go to remove it. So once I have that stitched, I'm going to take it to the iron. Some people like to use one of those little seam rulers just to press it. My fabric is starched, and so usually sometimes I can just kind of do it with my fingernail, and it lays back really nicely. Just make sure that you have it back all the way. Don't leave any tucks in it. And then you're going to put the second piece down. And so again, when I go to put the second piece down, I'm simply layering it up there, making sure that it's going to be down in where it's going to be trimmed off. You can always cut your fabric bigger if this bothers you. I try to, in my directions, not have too much waste, because foundation paper piecing is sort of wasteful with fabric, because we do have things to trim off, so we're not using the exact size piece that we need. So I put it that way. I can again put my pins in, or I can simply, if I'm by my machine, I can like hold it very carefully and put it, since it's small enough, and just put it right under and feed it right through my machine. And when you feed it through your machine, the first one was there. This is my second one. So it's stitched right there. Again, I stitched from off onto the line to off. Then you're going to press this out, and it's going to look like this. The only thing I have left to do is to trim it up. Instead of trimming up, to talk a minute about trimming up, instead of trimming up just simply on the lines that's provided, you know, this is only as accurate as your printer is printing on something like this. And I always stress to students, you know, making sure that you check your printer settings before you print something like this. Most printers I have found, or many printers I have found that I use or have used, often print to a scale. They print fit to page, which is not necessarily 100% of the pattern. And so you have to go in, and those settings are kind of hidden on your printer. And so you kind of have to look around and find where your printer setting is for that particular printing style. And you want it to say actual size or 100%. Those are the only two that I've ever seen. Some printers may say something else, but 100% or actual size is what you want to be bulleted when you are printing something. And so just to make sure this is, and again, I couldn't find my 2.5 inch. This is a 2.5 inch square trimmed down to. So we'll finish at 2 inches. I could not find my 2.5 square, but that's okay, because I think it's great. I'll show you how I use a bigger square in order to trim it if I don't have the right size. First of all, just to lay this on here, you can see that it is pretty much my line from the pattern, from the paper, is right along the 2.5 inch line. So this did print out a correct 2.5 inch size for the outer trim line. But instead of trimming on that, I sometimes like to trim over here. And when I trim over here, I want to make sure that I'm not cutting off points. And so like the upper should be Let me use my ruler this way, you can see it better. The 1/4 inch is coming right across the top. So that, when you lay it down here, make sure that right there, you're seeing that, and you want your 1/4 inch seam right there is where you're going to be trimming. So I trim, let me get it lined up here. And I want to make sure that it's not just lined up on the top, but also on the sides. And I trim, and I trim. I'm using a 3.5 inch ruler, so I'm going to have to stop, turn that around, line up to my cut edge, and trim the other 2 sides. Now, we come back to where we were talking in the very beginning when I showed you my paper, where this was not into the corners. Let me talk a little bit about this again. When you look here, you will look here and you'll say, I followed all those lines and look, I don't have a 1/4 inch. That's not a 1/4 inch. That one looks better, but look over here, it looks like my ruler got a little happy. And so let me trim a little bit of that off because we've got a little bit too much there, actually. You know, this is only as accurate as you cut and sew. So, okay, let me show you this little sample that I have made. Remember when you are, this is unfinished, 2.5 inch unfinished. So remember that you're going to be taking a seam on all these sides sooner or later, okay? So your 1/4 inch at the top that you have here, I can see it easiest with this little dashed line, I think. It's going to come right there at the very top of your little tip of your triangle. That's going to be your 1/4 inch seam. It's going to get sewed in somewhere along the line, okay? When you come down here, remember that you have a 1/4 inch there that's going to be sewed in. If you can see with my ruler, and then I'll show you a different way. And then with another ruler, let me show you this. I have a 1/4 inch along the bottom. So when you look there, I don't want to use my pen here. You're going to be coming down there and coming across there, and it's going to put your seam right there. 1/4 inch coming down here, 1/4 inch coming across the bottom. See how that seam is going to get caught right there, exactly where you want it to be. So that will be turned into a seam. This will be turned into a seam. And you have a perfect point in the corner. I got a little happy. My ruler slipped there, and I got 2 lines, and then I couldn't erase. I couldn't with what the pencil I was using. So, like 1/4 inch there. Can you see that? How it all comes perfectly aligned with your 1/4 inch seam. So those down at the bottom don't count. It's up here where you're going to be sewing it a 1/4 inch in is what counts for your seam allowance. So that's a little tricky. It's a little optical illusion. So hopefully if you can rewind, if you didn't miss something, remember that you always keep right sides of your fabric together when you're sewing things together. So that means that you have to start out with your right side down on your cutting surface, on your light board, wherever you're doing, wrong side of your paper to wrong side of your fabric. Always allows you to be able to see your lines and sew on your lines. Okay, so when you put this, the other thing you can do when you're lining this up to make sure you're lined up correctly is before you put a pin in there, is take and pretend like you're holding a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Flip that over like it's going to be in the end. Look in your up to the light and see if you can see all of your seam allowances have fabric covering them, because you need to have seam allowance with fabric, or else it's not going to be a seam allowance, is it? Thanks for watching, and stay tuned for my next tip along the way. And I hope you will find that you can maybe don't have to be a purist in your sewing, that you can figure out and look at a pattern and read a pattern and figure out, well, how do I like to make half square triangles? How do I like to make flying geese? And not necessarily do them like the pattern writer does them. Sometimes, to be honest, pattern writers write a pattern the simplest way to write it, and it may not even be how they really do all of their piecing. It's simply, they've tested it to make sure that it works, hopefully, but sometimes pattern writers will write things so that it's in the most common terminology. Like, I like to use half square triangles paper, and a lot of people don't write for half square triangle paper because a lot of people don't like this foundation paper piecing stuff. I do, so that's, I use it in my teaching a lot. So anyway, thanks, and hopefully stop back. And if you don't already follow me over on Instagram, give me a follow over at C Shriver 870. Have a good rest of the day. Thanks. Bye-bye.